Hey guys, it's Neffy. Sorry it's been so long since I did a video, but we're gonna get right into it, okay? Let's make up for lost time. So there's this video that's been floating around social media of a man who claims to have been an ex-pastor by the name of Dr. Ray Hagins. And in this video, he makes a claim that Christianity predates Christ. That there were people who were called Christians who were actually worshipers of some other god, and that this somehow leads into a conspiracy of creating Jesus so that the African mind will be brainwashed, etc., etc. You know this feel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the video clip of him discussing this in its entirety. I'm also going to link it in the description box so you can go back to the original YouTube channel and watch it. I'm going to play it uncut. And then I'll meet you back here in about 6.5 minutes so we can break this thing down. All right? I'll be right back.
Not Alexander the Great. Alexander the Greek. Wasn't nothing great about him. Y'all following what I'm saying? Ptolemy I, Soter, was a good friend of Alexander. And that's how he ended up becoming the first European pharaoh of Kemet. Check out his boldness. He took upon himself the name Mariamen Satepenra. Sound familiar? Ursa Ma'at Satepenra Rametsu Mariamen. Mary means beloved or loved. Amen is God. So Mariamen means beloved or loved of God. Satepenra means chosen by God. He wasn't given this name. He took it upon himself. Well, he insisted that they make an image in his honor. Oh, shucks now. The Egyptians didn't want to do that, so he started putting them to death. So he found a group of sellout Egyptians, Melkite, Coptic Egyptians, and the city of Menepha, which is known today as Memphis. The priest at Memphis, which was also the capital back then, the priest at Memphis said, "We'll consecrate you to the priesthood." Why did they sell out? Right, to save their behind. Exactly. Guess what? It still goes on today. So they sold out and they consecrated him to the office of Pharaoh, and they made an image. They made an image in honor of him, and this image is called Serapis. Y'all following me? Y'all sure? So you got to understand this. You can't share this with nobody else if you don't understand it. The worship of Serapis. You see, this dude, Ptolemy I, there it is. That's Serapis, the Egyptian version of Serapis, dating back to approximately 350 BCE. This is the image that they made in honor of Ptolemy I Soter. All right. Okay? What is Serapis? They took the name Osiris and combined it with the word Apis, which means the bull. Osiris. It became Serapis. Now here's the deep thing about it. Ptolemy I tried to incorporate the religion of the Greeks into Egypt by creating the worship of a new god. And this was that god in honor of him called Serapis. Now, it was really a composite deity, as you see here. Again, as I said, made up. It looked kind of dumb, don't it? But hey, you know, the Egyptians had to give him something to appease him. Okay? And as you see here, over here is the Greco-Roman version of Serapis, the painting. How do you know that's Serapis? By the cup on top of his head. Y'all see it? Now, what year are we talking here? Greco-Roman, 135 BCE. So this can't be Jesus. If he had existed, it can't be Jesus. You follow what I'm saying? This is the image that the Greeks made the Africans worship. Yeah, buddy. In fact, show you how deep this goes. There was a correspondence from Emperor Hadrian referring to the Alexandrian worshippers. Where's Alexandria? Come on, talk to me. Where's Alexandria? In Egypt, Africa, right? Yes. The Alexandrian worshippers of Serapis calling themselves what? The bishops of Christ. Now that's deep. There was no Jesus. There was no Jesus. But yet these people refer to themselves as the bishops of Christ. And here's what he says. Egypt, which you commended to me, my dearest Sir Servianus, I have found to be wholly fickle and inconsistent. Putting down Egypt, okay, I can deal with that. And continually wafted about by every breath of fame, the worshippers of Serapis here are called what? Wait a minute. The worshippers of Serapis are called Christians. And those who are devoted to the god Serapis, I find, call themselves the bishops of Christ. Don't take my word for it, family. Go verify it. Just type this in right here on the internet. This whole thing will come up. Now, what does that mean? That means, brothers and sisters, that in Africa, this image of Serapis that goes all the way back to 350 BCE had become the object of worship. Y'all following me? This was by...
Now remember, he said this.
Don't take my word for it, family. Go verify it. Don't take my word for it, family. Go verify it. Don't take my word for it, family. Go verify it.
And that's exactly what we're going to do. Okay, so now that I've shown you the video in its entirety, we can skip through it to get to the points where I need to hit. So let's go with point number 1, which was right about here.
To the office of Pharaoh, and they made an image. They made an image in honor of him, and this image is called Serapis.
So here he's saying that the Egyptians created Serapis in order to honor Ptolemy, and they did so at Ptolemy's request.
All right. Y'all following me? Y'all sure? So you got to understand this. You can't share this with nobody else if you don't understand it. The worship of Serapis. You see, this dude, Ptolemy the First, there it is. That's Serapis, the Egyptian version of Serapis, dating back to approximately 350 BCE. This is the image that they made in honor of Ptolemy the First.
This is the image that they made in about 350 BCE, that they made in honor of Ptolemy. The P is silent. In honor of Ptolemy. So he also showed us this picture here, which said that Ptolemy was born in 367. So in order for this image to have been made in honor of Ptolemy, Ptolemy would have been 17 years old when this image was created, if it was in fact created in 350 BC. But we know that that is entirely inaccurate because the man would have only been 17 years old. And he didn't start to rule in Egypt. He didn't become pharaoh in Egypt until 305. So the way time works as far as the ancient calendar, around the turn of the era is what they call the difference between BC and AD. And because I'm a Christian, I stick with BC and AD instead of BCE and CE. But the way it works is you count backwards. So they're counting down to 0, and then we move from 0 forward. So right now we're in the year 2000. And if we're talking about the year 350 BC, it would have been count from, well, not in the year 2000, we're in the year 2019. We count backwards from 2019 back to 0, and then continue to go backwards, kind of like counting negatives. So Ptolemy would have been 17 years old in 350. That's inaccurate, but that's not really that major of a point. So let's go to the next point, which is that he's saying that they created a new god in order for the Egyptians to worship. So I did some research, and I looked for some websites that would clarify this information or verify this information. And I found this website here that talks about this in great detail. Now, you're not going to find too many credible sites that are going to discuss this whole composite god. Not necessarily that it was a composite god, but the supposed link between Christianity and Serapis or Serapis. You're not really going to find too much of that because it's false, but we'll get into that. So here's a website. It's touregypt.net. It's not, to me, it's not a reputable site in terms of looking for facts or trying to verify something historically. I would not use this, but it was one of the very few that discussed this. And so I will show you a better website in a second. But for the point of this particular argument that we're making here, which is that he's saying that Serapis was created, a new god that was introduced into Egypt by Ptolemy. It says right here, he was a composite of several Egyptian and Hellenistic deities who was introduced to the world at the beginning of the Ptolemaic period. Now, here's where we're going to find some issue, because they're saying that he was introduced to the world at the beginning of the Ptolemaic Greek period in Egypt during the reign of Ptolemy I, though his legacy lasted well into the Roman period. Thus, he was meant to be a bridge between the Greek and Egyptian religion. That's fine. So then we're going to skip down here. We're going to see some of the stuff that Dr. Hagins was referring to in terms of the fusion of Osiris and the bull Apis, which by the Greek period might have been said to have represented the essence of the Egyptian religion. In fact, a cult of this combination god, a cult of which god? A cult of Serapis. A cult of this combination god had existed in Egypt prior to the rule of the Ptolemies. Now, that doesn't make any sense. How is it that it's going to be introduced to the world at the beginning of the Ptolemaic period and then at the same time have existed prior to the rule of the Ptolemies? Especially if you're saying that it was created, as the brother emphasized, it was created in honor, an image in honor of Ptolemy. How can it have pre-existed? How can it have predated Ptolemy if he created it? But again, that's just one point to show that the brother here is in error. Very simple point. Let's move on. To this point here.
So this can't be Jesus.
He says, so this can't be Jesus. Okay, brother, hold on now. Who said it was Jesus? The only person making the assumption or the assertion at this point that this is Jesus is him. So why did he feel the need to say 135 BC, this can't be Jesus? He is creating a narrative. See how subtle that is? He basically answered a question that you didn't ask, thereby implanting in your mind the idea that there is a relation, a connection between Serapis and Jesus, but nobody ever said that there was. Now he's claiming that Serapis was called Christ, Serapis Christus, right? And we're going to go back to this site here, which again, touregypt.net, you can look it up here. I don't recommend this website just because I don't think that this .net, I don't take that seriously. But if we go down, it talks a lot about the temples that were dedicated to Serapis. It talks about Serapis and early Christianity. Here's a section here. He may have finally had ties within early Christian community. There were certainly some similarities between Serapis and the Hebrew God. That's a matter of opinion. That's not a matter of fact. But let's move on. It quotes this same letter that we're going to get to in a second, the letter from Hadrian to Serapis in 134 AD. Nevertheless, how great confusion between Serapis and Christ could have existed is really somewhat questionable. In 68 AD, a mob of pagans is said to have formed at the Serapis Temple in Alexandria, who then descended on the Christians who were celebrating Easter. There, they seized Mark, dragging him through the streets before throwing him in prison. Clearly, those worshippers of Serapis and Christ were aware of each other and the differences within their religions, though perhaps at a later date, some amongst their worshippers either may have chosen to cover all of their options. But this is the point I want to bring you to, this very last statement here. Christus may be translated as Messiah, though the term need not apply to any specific Messiah, such as Jesus. It therefore could have simply been applied to Lord Serapis, so that in fact there was never any connection at all between the early Christians and the worshippers of Serapis. This is a website that, again, we read how they were claiming that it was introduced by Ptolemy. It definitely seems to be in line with a lot of what Hagins is saying, but it diverges on that point. And I'm not relying on this. So don't hang up or don't leave thinking, okay, she's using this website she says isn't even credible because it's proving her point. No. Nephew, don't work like that. Let's go back to the video. For our final...
In Egypt, Africa, right? Yes. The Alexandrian worshippers of Serapis calling themselves what? The bishops of Christ.
Now let's point something out here. He titled it this, he gave it this basic summary up here. But there's something very important that you need to notice. This letter was written when? 134 AD. Long after Christ would have been born, died, and resurrected. 134 AD. This is the only piece of evidence that he has introduced in the entire video. He gave you a picture of a statue, put two pictures of statues, and he stamped names on them and dates on them, but he didn't give a source. He didn't say where those pictures came from. For all we know, those could have been pictures of Horus, although we know better. The point still is that if you haven't been familiarized with this material, he's basically pulling it out of thin air. This is the one piece of evidence that he claims makes the claim that there were Christians that predate Christ.
There was no Jesus.
As he says, what do you mean there was no Jesus? Of course there was a Jesus by 134 AD.
There was no Jesus. But yet these people refer to themselves as the bishops of Christ.
Now, let's get to this because this is a very big point here. The letter that he just quoted is from Hadrian to Serapis. It is not written originally in English. Let's please remember that we're talking about ancient Greeks writing to each other at a time where they ruled Egypt. So the language was clearly not English. But I did happen to be able to find, by God's grace, an original translation, of the letter. So this is the letter. This is at uchicago.edu, and .edu, I'm going to do a video on research itself. But .edu is more reputable because that means that it comes from a university, an accredited university. So typically when you find material on these websites, it's going to have been written by a professor. In a minority of cases, you'll find information that has been published on the website by a student, but most of the time it's going to be a faculty member. So here's the letter. Here's the first letter. And then you see from Hadrian to Serapis, which is the same thing that he just quoted from. Okay, but let's read what was said first. Saturninus was a Gaul by birth, one of a nation that is ever most restless and always desirous of creating either an emperor or an empire. To this man, above all the other generals, because it seems certain that he was truly the greatest, Aurelian had given the command of the eastern frontier, wisely charging him never to visit Egypt. For, as we see, this far-sighted man was well acquainted with the Gallic character and feared that if Saturninus visited this turbulent land, he might be drawn by association with the inhabitants to a course toward which he was by nature inclined. For the Egyptians, as you know well enough, are puffed up, madmen, boastful, doers of injury, and in fact liars and without restraint, always craving something new. Even in their popular songs, writers of verse, makers of epigrams, astrologers, soothsayers, quacksalvers. Among them indeed are Christians and Samaritans, and those who are always ill-pleased by the present, though enjoying unbounded liberty. But lest any Egyptian be angry with me, thinking that what I have set forth in this writing is solely my own, I will cite one of Hadrian's letters, taken from the works of his freedman Phlegon, which fully reveals the character of the Egyptians. So he introduces the letter. Now here's the letter itself. From Hadrian to Servanius, the consul greeting. The land of Egypt, the praises of which you have been recounting to me, my dear Servanius, I have found to be wholly light-minded, unstable, and blown about by every breath of rumor. Those who worship Serapis are, in fact, Christians. And those who call themselves bishops of Christ are, in fact, devotees of Serapis. Now let's stop. Let's read that again. It says, those who worship Serapis are, in fact, Christians. It does not say what he claims it said, which is, the worshipers of Serapis here are called Christians. Notice the subtle difference. The worshipers of Serapis are called Christians? No. Excuse me. No, it does not say that. What it says is, those who worship Serapis are in fact Christians, and those who call themselves the bishops of Christ are in fact devotees of Serapis. Now I'm going to read further so that we can understand what he's trying to say. There is no chief of the Jewish synagogue, no Samaritan, no Christian presbyter who is not an astrologer, a soothsayer, or an anointer. Even the patriarch himself, when he comes to Egypt, is forced by some to worship Serapis, by others to worship Christ. They are a folk most seditious, most deceitful, most given to injury. But their city is prosperous, rich, and fruitful, and in it no one is idle. So, just look at the language here. What he's saying is, you have people who call themselves Christians who are worshiping this false god Serapis. There are people you will find in Serapis's temple who also call themselves Christians, meaning that they're supposed to be worshipers of Christ, but they're in here in the temple of Serapis. And that point that I just made is proven when he says there is no chief of the Jewish synagogue, no Samaritan, no Christian presbyter who is not also an astrologer, a soothsayer, or an anointer, meaning that these people are practicing things that are contrary to what it means to be a Christian. And they're making a distinction. Here, Hadrian is making a distinction between the worshipers of Serapis and the worshipers of Christ. Even the patriarch himself, when he comes to Egypt, is forced by some to worship Serapis, by others to worship Christ. Now, let's keep in mind that this letter is written in 134 AD. Christianity was alive and thriving, very much so thriving by this time, even in Egypt. It was thriving by this time. So his claim, Mr. Hagins' claim, is completely without merit. Guys, before I let you go, I almost forgot. In my research, I came across this book, Serapis or Serapis Under the Early Ptolemies, which was published in 1972. It goes into a great deal of discussion about this is just a preview, so the blue portion is what's available, about who Serapis was, where he came from, and his origin and whatnot, his introduction to Egypt. So here it says, it is in the 3rd century that the name of Serapis attained sudden prominence, that his praises are sung loudly and enthusiastically, both in his homeland, Egypt, and in many other parts of the Greek world. I just thought that was interesting because it identifies Egypt as the homeland of Serapis, not Greece. It's saying that it's Egypt. Okay, and another point that I needed to make really quickly is that his being identified as Serapis or Osiris and Apis, the bull, that is an object of contention. Scholars do not really agree as to this being a conglomerate god between Osiris and Apis. What happened was, and you can read it in this book, just 10 pages, that gives you a very cursory understanding of what's going on here. But what happened was, when when Ptolemy made Serapis his icon, not invented and created, but adopted, that's a better word. When he adopted Serapis as his icon, Serapis gained popularity. And so as he was gaining popularity, the people wanted to make it seem as though their God was an ancient God, because gods cannot be created. So how could he have been a God of recent invention? And in an effort to make him seem more ancient, they tied him with more ancient gods. And so we'll find here that there was no consensus as to which ancient god they wanted to tie him to. They made efforts to tie him to Osiris. Some are of the opinion that Osiris is Serapis. And then there's a very great detailed argument here. These passages raise further questions. Who proposed each of these identifications? In what context? Are they the result of court propaganda, scholarly theory, or popular piety? So basically, the people wanted to, like I said, they wanted to make him an ancient deity. And so they tied him to more widely respected and ancient deities. But this comes from this idea that it's Osiris and Apis combined, comes from a guy named Wilkins, and his conclusions deserve the general acceptance they have received, for they surely reflect the original view, the official view of Serapis, which prevailed especially at Memphis in the 2nd century. But the whole point of that is it's Osiris Apis here. Osiris Apis was a god that predated Serapis. So that whole thing about it being a bull and all that is not entirely accurate. The next point here, before I let you go, is that ancient sources do not agree as to whether it was Ptolemy the first, the second, or the third. So again, this guy, Ptolemy, did not create Serapis. What he did was he adapted this god. So the tradition says that he was dreaming one night and he was visited in his dreams by a god who was later identified as Serapis, who says, bring my statue from this far region over here into Egypt. So if there was a statue that he wouldn't have grabbed, clearly somebody was already worshiping Serapis, and it wasn't created by the Egyptians as an image to him. And this is very simple. This very basic error that Ray Hagins is making. He's making this error to say that he created this. This was created in his image so that the Egyptians would worship him. That is not true. It's false. So this section here goes into great detail. And again, you'll find down here sources cited, ancient sources cited, and you can go ahead and look those up. But it's basically making the argument here that they're not even sure as to whether it was the first Ptolemy, the third, and even Ptolemy the second, which of them had this dream and brought the statue over to Egypt. Whether the statue actually came from Sinope is not clear. So again, there's a statue that already exists where people are already worshiping this god, which was not created by Ptolemy. And my final point here, I wanted to show you here on page 10. Again, Ptolemy did not begin reigning in Egypt until 305. 305. And remember, we count down. So he was reigning in 305. And then here in this last paragraph, it says, still other passages which use the name Serapis point beyond the time of the first Ptolemy to that of Alexander himself. For those of you who don't know, Alexander the Great is the predecessor, rather, of Ptolemy the first. The remark of Diogenes, already cited, presupposes that Alexander is still alive. Two of the Alexander lives mention a temple of Serapis in Babylon in 323 BC. If there is a temple of Serapis in Babylon in 323, what is that? My math isn't great. So it's at least, 8 years prior 18 years prior to Ptolemy even becoming Pharaoh, somebody was worshiping Serapis. So there we have that. That's what I wanted to show you really quickly before I let you go. So thanks you guys for watching. A quick review. Basically, number one, Ptolemy did not begin reigning in 350 when he was born in 367. He was not 17 years old when he began reigning in Egypt. He was about 50 years old. That's error number one. Error number two, he did not invent. The Egyptians did not create, sellout Egyptians did not create Serapis as an image to Ptolemy, because Serapis already existed prior to the Ptolemaic reign. And there was a Babylonian temple to Serapis in 323 BC. Aside from that, the statue which he in his dream was supposed to get and bring to Egypt was in a temple where people were already worshiping Serapis. So they did not create this god. He was not called Serapis Christus. There is no information anywhere aside from bootleg websites that were written probably by people who got that information from Ray Hagins himself, as opposed to independent sources. You can't find it. There's no connection between Serapis and being called Christus. You might as well say he made that up. Furthermore, that letter that he showed you from 134 AD, when he said there was no Jesus, there was a Jesus, and that Jesus was born, died, and resurrected by 134 AD. The letter that he quoted, he misquoted. And they are not called Christians. There were Christians who were practicing paganism and pagans who called themselves Christians. But it didn't say that the people here who worship Serapis are called Christians because his name is also Serapis Christus. It is a flat out lie. Stay tuned for the next video where we're going to debunk more of Ray Hagins' information. Thank you and good night.